of the theories, one of the strongly backed theories that you hold in Beyond Bilal is that the West African Muslims got to the Americas before Columbus.
Yeah.
And Almaris.
That's one of the crazy conspiracy theories that I believe.
Yeah. So I mean, you say that Almaris's account of Mansa Musa and the voyage to North America.
Yes. So we spoke about Mansa Musa earlier. Richest man to have ever lived, emperor of the Mali Empire. Mansa Musa, when he's in Egypt, is speaking to the Emir of Cairo, and he tells him the story of how he became the emperor of the Mali Empire. And he says his older brother wanted to see what was on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So he sets up 200 ships full of people and 100 ships full of food and water and sends them across the ocean, and only one ship returns. So after that, he equips 2,000 ships with Muslims, black West African Muslims from the Mali Empire, Mandinka people. They enter these ships, and he is the general of the navy of these ships. He leads them across the Atlantic Ocean, and he gives Mansa Musa the kingdom, and he says, if I return, then I'll take the kingdom back. If not, then you're the king. And he never returns. So if these 2,000 ships set off, and this is in the early 1300s, before Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492, that means that if they arrived on the other side, free black Muslims of West African origin arrived to the Americas before Christopher Columbus. And this is something that when we look at the narrative of the third voyage of Christopher Columbus, he says, we found canoes that seem to come from the coast of Guinea, which is West Africa. He says the natives have come to us with cloths that are similar to the Almazar cloths which the Moors in Spain were using, the Muslims who were trading with West African Muslims, and cloths similar to the cloths that we find in the coast of Guinea and in the mountains of Sierra Leone. This is all in the narrative of the third voyage, directly narrated by a crew member of Christopher Columbus himself. They interview some of the conquistadors, the Spanish explorers who were colonizing the Americas in the 1500s. They say they met, for example, the King of Panama, and he says there was a group of black people with golden spears who were fighting us, the natives, and they came from another place and they were shipwrecked and they came here and now we're at war with them. And Christopher Columbus takes these spears and tests them, and they're made up of gold, silver and copper in the exact same formula that the spears of the warriors in the Mali Empire have their spears made. And all of this is documented, and there's a professor in Harvard University called Leo Weiner. In the year 1920, you can Google him as well, he writes a book called Africa and the Discovery of the Americas. So he's a European professor that moves to America, and he becomes a professor of archaeology or anthropology at Harvard. And he puts this theory forward that, looking at the evidence, there were definitely Africans here in the Americas before Christopher Columbus arrived to the Americas. And he provides all the evidence, which of course in that era, Jim Crow era, is rejected, and he's silenced and he's made fun of. But he's a Harvard University professor that wrote an entire book on this subject over 100 years ago.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we're talking America South and North, including the Pirates of the Caribbean, which is something a lot of people commented under our video about.
Yeah.
Do you know the story, the Muslim origin of the Pirates of the Caribbean?
Yeah, so the Pirates of the Caribbean, the pirate that the story was based upon, converted to Islam and became Muslim. And a lot of pirates during that period of time were converting to Islam and becoming Muslim. So if you look, Jack Ward was known later as Yusuf Rais. He was an English pirate who later became a corsair for the Ottoman Empire, operating out of Tunis, and he converted to Islam. And he's the inspiration behind the Pirates of the Caribbean. So the Pirates of the Caribbean, Jack Sparrow, is based upon a historical pirate who became Muslim.
Was he black or white?
Nah, he was English.
He was English, and he became Muslim.
He became
Englishman.
Muslim. Yeah, through interacting with the Ottoman Empire, who was ruling North Africa at the time, he eventually became Muslim and converted to Islam.
Wow, look at that. Jack Ward was he converted to Islam and served in the Ottoman Empire in the last of his years under the Algerian governor. SubhanAllah.
Yeah.
And
so Muslim history is everywhere.
Yeah. Disney, bro.
Lion King was Muslim. Pirates of the Caribbean are Muslim.
Disney's after us, dog.
The world is after us.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's some fascinating stories that you mentioned in Beyond Bilal about Muslims in South America. Mm-hmm. And one of them being the resistance and the revolutions that happened in Brazil. The Portuguese also faced resistance by enslaved African Muslims, specifically in a region called Bahia.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about it?
So before I even go to that region, I want to actually talk about the first ever slave revolt that happened in the history of the transatlantic slave trade.
Was that during Ramadan?
It was not during Ramadan. It was during Christmas.
Okay.
And this revolt happened in the island of Santiago, which we now know today as the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And this was before the Haitian Revolution. So this island, which we now know today as Haiti and the Dominican Republic, it was one island and it was under Spanish control. And the ruler of the island was Don Diego Columbus, the son of Christopher Columbus. And so in the 1500s, they began the transatlantic slave trade. They were bringing Africans over. And the first Africans that they enslaved from the Senegal region. So they were Muslims of Wolof ethnicity. And so these Wolof Muslims are there in this island working as slaves on the plantations there. And on Christmas Day, they decided to do a revolt against the Spanish and against the son of Christopher Columbus. And so they rise up, they enter into the house, they start killing people, etc. And then they're all put to death eventually, and the rebellion was quelled. But that's the first ever revolution or revolt that we see in the history of the transatlantic slave trade, and it was done by Muslims. And it's after that that the King of Spain starts to ban the practice of Islam amongst the slave population in the Caribbean. And this begins the whole process of Christianization and the changing of the names of the slaves and making them not be able to practice their traditional religions. And Islam was one of those traditional religions, if not the main traditional religion. So this whole creation of the African American people, essentially, and the Afro-Caribbean people as a people who do not have connection to their language or their history in Africa, began as a reaction to the fact that the Muslims were using Islam to inspire them to revolt.
The African Muslims.
And so we see the same thing happen again in Portugal, or in the Portuguese colony in Brazil. Brazilian slave trade were taking Muslims from Nigeria and from all over West Africa, but specifically from Nigeria, and amongst them were Yoruba Muslims and Nupe Muslims, and even a small minority of Hausa Muslims as well, who were sold into slavery. And all of these Muslims from all of these different places, coupled with the Muslims that came from Senegal, coupled with the Muslims that came from Mali and came in through Guinea and all of these areas, were all living on these plantations in Brazil. And most people don't know, more Africans were taken to South America during the transatlantic slave trade than North America, and more to Brazil than anywhere else. So Brazil has the largest African diaspora outside of Africa, because there are more people of African descent in Brazil than any other country in the world outside of Africa, because of this transatlantic slave trade.
That's why Brazilians have such a dark complexion, some of them,
especially in the area of Bahia. Even if you Google, for example, Bahia, and you see the people there, a lot of them are clearly black, clearly African descent people.
And right? Brazilians now would never think that their origins are some of them Muslim.
They would never. But what's interesting is, in Bahia, there was something called the Bahia Revolt. And what happened was, on the plantations, the Muslims are practicing Islam still. So they have Quranic schools, they have madrasas, they have mosques, they're fasting in the month of Ramadan, they're praying Taraweeh. And in the month of Ramadan, the imams of the community gather everybody together and they declare jihad against the slave owners. And they rise up, they have a revolt, and it was called the Male Revolt, M-A-L-E. And this comes from the word used for Muslims in the Yoruba language, because in Yoruba, Islam is called Esim Male, the religion of Mali, because Islam came to the Yoruba people through traders who came in from the Mali Empire. So it has two meanings: Mali in connection to the empire of Mansa Musa, and Esim Male, which is the Yoruba word for Muslim, because there were Yoruba Muslims mostly who were part of this revolt. And so they try to overthrow the slave owners, but unfortunately the revolution is quelled, and many of them are killed, many of them are imprisoned, and then a large population of them are actually sent back to Africa. And so they settle in Lagos and they form their own community. And I have a friend called Habib Akande who's written a whole book about this and an in-depth study of this. So if you Google Habib Akande, most of the books that he has are about Islamic sexuality and Islamic history. But if you go to his books, he has one book called, they don't even put it as one of the books, but put Brazil in there. And then Habib Akande, just go to normal Google, not Google Books. Yeah, Illuminating the Blackness, this one here. Click that one. No, this black one here with the black man on it. This one. Yeah. So I do have a friend called Habib Akande who's written an in-depth study of this, and he's written this book, Illuminating the Blackness, Blacks and African Muslims in Brazil. And this book details the entire history of this movement and the revolutions that happened. And it's after that that the King of Portugal starts to now crack down on the practice of Islam in the colonies. And so he bans Islam, he bans the slaves from being able to practice Islam, etc. The people who practice traditional African religions were able to hide their religion within Catholicism. So you see these religious traditions develop in the Latin-speaking world, such as Santeria, and the Orisha religions, which are still practiced today in Brazil, in Cuba, in all of these countries, where they would take their traditional West African deities that they were worshipping and associate them with Catholic saints. So they could pretend to be Christian on the outside, but they're still practicing their African religion on the inside. And that allowed the religion to survive, but Islam wasn't given the same chance because we can't combine our religion with anything else. And so eventually Islam starts to die out in those regions. But even up until the early 1900s, there's still Muslim communities in Brazil that were descended from West African Muslims who were practicing Islam and were able to pass on their Islam.
SubhanAllah. Can you tell me about the prince amongst the slaves?
Abdur Rahman, sorry. So there's a movie, and the movie is called Prince Among Slaves, and it's based upon the story of a West African prince called Abdur Rahman bin Sori. He's a Fulani prince from West Africa, and he was captured and enslaved, and he was taken to the Americas. And whilst he's taken to the Americas, it's discovered that he could read and write, and somebody who was shipwrecked, actually, it's a crazy story. He's a slave, he's enslaved, and he starts to grow vegetables in the plantation and he sells them in the market. Once he's selling his vegetables in the market one time, he comes across this white man who was once shipwrecked in Africa, and his father, who was a king, had taken him in. And so him as a child had seen this white man, and he used to speak to him, and the white man had even taught him some English as a child. Wow. When he's captured and taken to America as a slave, after many, many years, he comes across this white man in the market as he's selling his vegetables. So he starts to recognize him, he starts to talk to him, and then the white man goes to his master and says, "Do you know this man is a prince? He's not an ordinary slave." And so he starts to try to campaign for him to be freed. And they cause such a ruckus that the president of America at the time hears about it and invites him to come and meet him in the White House.
Because his character and knowledge was also renowned, right?
Exactly, because he could read and write, he could speak Arabic. Everybody knew that this man was different. And so the president, he has a meeting with the president, I think it's John Quincy Adams at that time, and the president gives him his freedom. The president says, "You can be free on condition that you return to Africa immediately and don't stay here in America, because if he stays in America as a free man, it will inspire other slaves to also try and get their freedom." And so he's given the opportunity to go to Liberia, and there are two places in West Africa where, towards the end of the transatlantic slave trade, there are many people of African descent who were enslaved in the Americas, in North America, that are given the opportunity to return to Africa. And they can return to Sierra Leone, to the capital Freetown, and that's why it's called Freetown, because it became the town where liberated Africans could be free. And Liberia, which comes from the word liberty, because it was a project by America to give African Americans a chance to return to Africa. And my ancestors on my mother's side are actually from those communities.
No way.
Yeah. So my mother, ethnically, she's Creole. She has Wolof ancestry through my grandmother's grandmother, who was Wolof. She was a Wolof princess. But the rest of the family, they're Creole, and they identify as Creole till today anyway. And so all my family on my mother's side, they have last names like Roberts, Jones, Williams, etc., because they were African American or Afro-Caribbean slaves or liberated Africans who were given the chance to return to Africa after the slave trade and towards the end of the transatlantic slave trade. So Abdur Rahman was one of them. He was given the opportunity to return. But what happens is that he has a wife and children, and they're not given freedom like he is. So he tries to campaign to get money to free his wife and his children. He's able to free his wife and some of his children, but then some of his children have to stay in bondage in America. And so his family splits into the part of the family that returned to Africa with him and the other part of the family that stayed here in America. And it was the family who stayed here in America who preserved his history that commissioned this film to be made about him, with Mos Def as the narrator of the film. And the film is called A Prince Among Slaves.
Wow. Incredible, man. Yeah. Incredible.